The husband decided to throw a party to celebrate the divorce, but in the middle of the festivities, a delivery man arrived with a box sent by his ex-wife, and everyone was shocked by what they saw. The sound that filled Richard Hayes's penthouse wasn't that of a wild party, but the expensive, subtle hum of success. It was the murmur of an invisible climate control system, the soft clink of ice in crystal glasses, and in the background, a smooth jazz instrumental as sophisticated as the panoramic view of San Francisco that spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard didn't need loud music. His very existence in that moment was the loudest celebration. He watched his reflection in the dark glass, a 45-year-old man at the peak of his form, a predator at the top of his personal food chain. The divorce, signed that morning, hadn't been a noisy liberation, but the quiet, efficient removal of one last obstacle in his path. Laura Bennett, his ex-wife, was now officially a relic of a past he was determined to forget, a past of weakness, pain, and dependency. A past he'd overcome with the same ruthless determination he'd used to build his tech empire. 5 years earlier, Richard's world was the opposite of that controlled silence. It was a pandemonium of sirens, hospital monitor beeps, and the echo of grim prognoses. A crash on Highway 101 had shattered more than his bones. It had shattered his identity. The dynamic entrepreneur gave way to a man confined to a bed, staring at a white ceiling and the terrifying possibility of life in a wheelchair. It was in that abyss that Laura appeared. She wasn't just his physical therapist. In the months that followed, she became his architect. With a patience that bordered on the sacred and a stubbornness that rivaled his own, she redesigned his body and, inadvertently, rebuilt his soul. She didn't just apply techniques. She studied his pains, his fears, the nights he woke screaming from nightmares of twisting metal. She pushed him to the brink of exhaustion, and when he cried in frustration, it was her hand that rested on his shoulder, firm, present, without pity. Their love wasn't born from candle-lit dinners, but from the smell of antiseptic, the sweat of effort, and the raw vulnerability of a man learning to trust another human, to simply stand up. The marriage was the natural consequence of that reconstruction. For 3 years they lived in a harmony that, in retrospect, seemed almost dreamlike. Richard, fueled by the second chance life had given him, became an unstoppable force in the market. But each new multi-million-dollar contract, each floor higher he climbed in his corporate skyscraper, pulled him a little further from the broken man Laura had loved and healed. Gratitude, once a source of warmth, began to feel like a debt, and Laura, with her simplicity and her work at a rehabilitation clinic, became the constant reminder of that debt. He started resenting her, not for who she was, but for what she reminded him he'd been. Brooke Taylor was the catalyst. 20 years younger, with an ambition sharp as a stiletto and eyes that reflected the admiration he now craved, she saw no debts or weaknesses. She saw only the end result, the power, the money, the success. She was hired as his executive assistant, but quickly became his confidant, the audience for whom he could display his new identity without the silent judgment of the past. The transition from professional admiration to intimacy was subtle, almost imperceptible. It started with business lunches that lingered, with confidences about the burden of his marriage, to a woman who couldn't keep up with his pace. Richard found himself painting Laura as a stagnant figure, stuck in sentimentality that he, a man of vision, could no longer tolerate. Every lie he told Brooke he told himself first, building a justification for the betrayal already blooming in his mind. The rupture wasn't an impulsive act, but a business decision. Laura had become a depreciated asset. On a Tuesday night, after coming home late from a strategic dinner with Brooke, he found Laura waiting in the living room. She made no accusations. There was just a deep sadness in her eyes, a weariness that seemed to come from months of undeclared battles. "Richard, I feel like I'm losing you," she said, her voice low. He could have lied, could have reassured her, but the performance had become exhausting. He chose efficient cruelty. "Losing? Laura, people don't lose each other, they outgrow them. I'm moving on. Maybe you should try it too." He climbed the stairs, leaving her alone in the room with the silent ruins of what had once been their love. That night he felt no guilt, just the cold relief of a decision made. The divorce filing days later was the execution. He summoned her to his home office, the same place where, years before, she'd helped him with fine motor exercises, teaching his fingers to grip a pen again. Now he used that same hand to push a document across the desk. "I think this formalizes what's already a reality," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "My lawyers were quite generous, considering the circumstances. The generosity was a cruel joke. She'd get next to nothing. He expected tears, anger, a scene. Instead, Laura read the document in silence, her expression unreadable. She asked just one question. "Why, Richard? After everything?" He leaned back in his chair, the expensive leather creaking under his weight. "Because gratitude has an expiration date, Laura, and mine's up." The coldness of the response seemed to finally hit her. She stood, shoulders straight, a dignity he found irritating. "I see," was all she said before leaving the office, leaving Richard alone with his empty victory and the uncomfortable feeling that perhaps the real battle hadn't started yet. The courtroom was a sterile environment, with beige walls and an air conditioner that hummed monotonously, a setting deliberately devoid of emotion. It was the perfect place for the surgical dismantling of a marriage. Laura arrived on time, alone. Her choice of clothing, a dark tailored pantsuit and a neutral silk blouse, spoke of professionalism and restraint. She wasn't there as a victim, but as someone fulfilling an inevitable procedure. She sat in silence, hands folded in her lap, her mind focused on one goal, getting through that moment with her dignity intact. She felt the weight of the situation, a dull ache in her chest, but there was also a cold clarity. The pain was for mourning the man she'd once loved. The clarity came from the certainty that that man no longer existed. Richard's arrival was, as expected, a performance. Accompanied by two expensive-looking lawyers and Brooke, who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion editorial, he exuded an aura of power and impatience, as if this mundane commitment was a waste of his precious time. Brooke, for her part, played the role of victorious consort. Her gaze slid over Laura with a mix of pity and triumph, a quick assessment that dismissed her as irrelevant. She clung to Richard's arm, not with affection, but with a sense of ownership, marking her territory. The hearing was brief. Richard's lawyer presented the settlement agreement with polished efficiency. It was, objectively, a financial massacre. The judge, a middle-aged man with a look that had seen it all, read the terms, and his face tightened in mild disapproval. He addressed Laura, his voice tinged with protocolar concern. "Ms. Bennett, do you understand that you're waiving nearly all rights to assets acquired during the marriage? Do you have legal representation?" Laura felt Richard's gaze on her, heavy, waiting for a slip, for a moment of weakness to validate his narrative. She took a deep breath, the sound almost inaudible in the silent room. "I understand the terms, Your Honor, and I waive representation. I just want this to end." Her voice didn't tremble. It was the voice of someone who'd already lost what truly mattered and no longer cared about the crumbs. The judge observed her for a long moment, perhaps seeing beyond the resignation, perceiving the strength behind that apparent submission. With nothing more to do, he banged the gavel. The dry wooden sound sealed the legal end of an era. Richard relaxed visibly in his chair, a micro smile touching his lips. The transaction was complete. As they left, Richard couldn't resist one last power play. While Laura waited outside, the cool San Francisco breeze lightly stirring her hair, he approached. Brooke stayed a few steps away, impatient. "I hope you don't hold any grudges, Laura. It was just business." Laura turned to him, and for the first time that day her eyes met his directly. There was no hate, no pain. There was something far more disturbing, an enigmatic calm. "Grudges are a luxury I don't allow myself, Richard. Just some advice. Enjoy your celebration tonight. Moments like that of pure victory are rare, and sometimes more fragile than they seem." He frowned, her words unsettling him for a moment. Was it a threat? A premonition? But the doubt was quickly swept away by arrogance. It was just the last gasp of a defeated woman. He shrugged and joined Brooke, who kissed him possessively. Laura watched them slide into the black Mercedes and drive away, the car gliding smoothly into the distance. She stayed there for another minute, not waiting for a ride but just breathing. Phase 1 of her plan was complete. Phase 2 would begin in a few hours. The party in the penthouse wasn't a raucous celebration, but a curated display of power. The guest list was a who's who of San Francisco's financial and tech elite. The atmosphere was one of exclusivity, the kind of event where multi-million-dollar deals are sealed between a sip of Japanese whiskey and a bite of foie gras canapé. Richard circulated among his guests, not as a host but as a monarch in his court. Each handshake, each congratulations on the new phase inflated his ego. He'd turned his divorce into a networking event. Brooke was in her element. She floated through the room, her expensive red dress a beacon of her new position. She was no longer the assistant. She was the future Mrs. Hayes, the partner, the living proof of Richard's ability to always get what he wanted. She chatted with the wives of the other magnates, practicing the role that would soon be hers permanently. There was, however, a small crack in her composure. Every now and then, her gaze sought out Richard, an almost anxious need for validation, to make sure he was seeing her shine. At the height of the night, Richard made a toast. No grandiloquent speeches, just a few calculated words. "To future projects and the partnerships that strengthen us," he said, raising his glass. His eyes met Brooke's across the room, and he added with a meaningful smile, "Especially the most intimate ones." It was enough. Everyone understood. The message was sent. It was in that moment of silent, absolute triumph that the private elevator buzzer sounded. The tone was discreet but unexpected. No one else was expected. One of Richard's security guards answered and, after a brief conversation, approached him with a confused expression. "Mr. Hayes, there's a delivery for you." The courier insists it must be received personally. A wave of irritation passed through Richard. "A delivery? Now? Tell them to leave it at the service desk." He said the sender's instructions, from a Ms. Laura Bennett, were explicit. "Only in your hands." Laura's name, uttered amid his court, was like a stone thrown into a calm lake. A curious silence spread through the nearest group. Brooke approached, her brow furrowed in displeasure. "What does that woman want now? Can't she stop embarrassing herself?" Intrigued and, against his will, a little apprehensive remembering her enigmatic words earlier, Richard walked to the foyer. The courier held a simple brown cardboard box, unmarked except for a small label with his name. It wasn't large nor heavy. It was anonymous. He signed the receipt, curiosity overriding irritation. What could it be? A last sentimental plea? A return of some old gift? He returned to the main room, box in hand. His guests watched, the business vibe replaced by an almost childish expectation of drama. Richard decided to use the situation to his advantage, turning it into entertainment. "Looks like I got one last gift from my ex-wife," he announced with a mocking tone. "Let's see what kind of relic from the past she decided to send me." He placed the box on an empty coffee table. With a silver pocket knife he used for cigars, he cut the tape with a precise gesture. He opened the cardboard flaps and looked inside. And the world, his carefully constructed world of power and control, simply stopped spinning. Time, for Richard, fragmented. The hum of conversations, the smooth melody of the jazz, the distant clink of a glass, everything disintegrated into an absolute white silence emanating from inside that cardboard box. His eyes, which moments before had surveyed his domain with a conqueror's satisfaction, were now fixed on the contents, unable to process the totality of what they saw. It was like staring at the sun. The mind recoiled, trying to protect itself from the intensity of that revelation. The air in his lungs seemed to solidify, turning every attempt to breathe into a conscious, painful effort. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold sensation rising from his feet to his nape, leaving him hollow, a fragile shell about to crumble. What Laura had sent wasn't a frontal attack, but a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The box wasn't filled with objects evoking nostalgia or guilt, like old photos or love letters. That would be predictable, the act of a purely sentimental woman. Laura, he realized now with growing terror, was much more than that. She was a strategist. The contents were sparse, almost minimalist, and each item chosen with the precision of a scalpel. There was a single folded sheet of paper resting atop a series of grainy black and white images, and beside them, nestled in a corner, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, a single tiny white woolen bootie. It was an object so innocent, so pure, that amid the cynical atmosphere of that party, it seemed profane, an anomaly from another universe. Brooke, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere around Richard, approached. Her initial irritation gave way to impatient curiosity. "Richard, what is it? Some kind of bad joke?" Her voice, normally an instrument of calculated seduction, sounded shrill in the forming silence. She tried to peek over his shoulder, but he remained immobile, a statue of shock blocking her view. The nearest guests, smelling drama of epic proportions, began to approach, forming a semicircle, an unwitting audience for their host's unraveling. With monumental effort, as if his muscles were submerged in molasses, Richard extended a trembling hand and took the sheet of paper. His fingers, which signed multi-million contracts without hesitation, could barely hold the envelope. Laura's handwriting was exactly as he remembered, elegant, clear, each letter perfectly formed. It was the same handwriting that had once filled out charts about his recovery, the same that wrote love notes left on his pillow. Now, it presented itself as the script of his public execution. "My dear Richard," the letter began, the formal greeting a slap of irony. "I write not to mourn the past, but to inform you of an inevitable future. I imagine that tonight, amid the celebrations of your newfound freedom, you're feeling in control of your destiny. It's a powerful sensation, I remember. But destiny, Richard, has a peculiar way of reminding us that our control is at best an illusion." Each word was a blow. He could almost hear her voice, calm and measured, reading the sentences in his mind. There was no anger in the tone, but a kind of clinical detachment which made it all the more devastating. "You referred to me as a weight, an anchor tying you to a past of vulnerability. It's an interesting metaphor. But you seem to have forgotten a specific night, just under 3 months ago, the night of June 18th. You might not remember. You were overwhelmed with preparations for your new life. But I remember. It was the night when, after an argument with Brooke on the phone, you came to our bedroom. You said nothing. You just lay beside me, seeking a silence and comfort that apparently your bright future couldn't offer. It was a silent act, almost a reflex, a return to a safe harbor you were already planning to demolish. That night, Richard, your anchor, didn't just hold you for a moment. It conceived. The word conceived exploded in Richard's mind. A buzzing started in his ears, drowning out the curious murmurs around him. He looked at the black and white images. Ultrasounds. They were unmistakably ultrasounds. And in one of the clearest images there were 3 small forms, 3 pockets of life, each circled by a thin pen. 3. The number hovered in his vision, mocking, impossible. The letter continued, merciless in its precision. "I know you're a man of facts and data, so I'll be direct. Attached are the exams confirming a 12-week gestation, and as you can see, life, in its infinite irony, decided that a single heir wouldn't be dramatic enough for your story. Congratulations, Richard. You'll be a father to triplets." At that moment, Brooke, tired of being kept in the dark, shoved Richard's arm hard enough to see the box's contents. Her eyes passed over the booty, landed on the images, and then voraciously read the last lines of the letter Richard held. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The color drained from Brooke's face, leaving behind a deathly pallor. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The woman who'd floated through the party like a queen now looked like a scared, lost girl. The champagne flute she held with such elegance simply plummeted from her hand, shattering on the marble floor with a sharp noise that made everyone flinch. The sound was the period at the end of the party. The spell was broken. The whispers turned into an audible buzz of shock and scandal. Words like pregnant, triplets, his, bounced around the room. Paul, his partner, who was closest, grabbed one of the documents from the box. It wasn't just an ultrasound image, but a detailed report, signed and stamped, with the name of one of San Francisco's most renowned obstetricians. There were charts, measurements, dates. It was a legal document, unassailable. "Richard, this is—" Paul started, but couldn't finish the sentence. He looked from the paper to his friend and partner's pale face, and understanding hit him. It wasn't a joke. It was real. Richard finally snapped from his paralysis by the sound of breaking glass, looked at Brooke. Her gaze was that of someone who'd just been stabbed in the back by the one who swore to protect her. The humiliation on her face was total. He'd placed her on a pedestal, announced her as his new partner in life and business, only for everyone to witness minutes later that he'd impregnated his ex-wife. And not with one, but 3 children. He hadn't crowned her queen, he'd branded her the fool. Laura's letter had a final paragraph, a coup de grace that showed how well she knew him. "Don't worry about formalities. My lawyers will contact yours to discuss the practical aspects of this new joint venture. After all, as you said earlier today, it's all just business, isn't it? Enjoy the rest of your celebration. You have much to celebrate." The party disintegrated. No formal goodbyes. The guests simply evaporated, fleeing the disaster scene with the haste of abandoning a sinking ship. The embarrassment was so palpable you could taste it in the air. In minutes, the penthouse, which had buzzed with San Francisco's elite, was nearly empty. A silent battlefield covered in abandoned glasses and untouched canapes. Richard stood in the center of the wreckage, the letter still in his hand, a piece of paper that had detonated his life. He stared into nothing, his mind a blank screen of panic. Brooke, recovering from the initial shock, was overtaken by an icy fury. The tears that sprang to her eyes weren't from sadness, but from rage and shame. "You lied to me," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You slept with her. While you were with me, you went back to her." "Brooke, I can explain," he began, his voice a thread. "Explain what? That you're a liar, that you used me as a trophy to parade at your divorce party while your ex-wife carried your 3 kids. You made a fool of me, Richard, in front of everyone." She yanked the heavy diamond ring from her finger, the same one he'd given her that morning, and threw it not at the box but at his face. The cold metal hit his cheek, leaving a red mark. "Keep your perfect family," she spat. "You all deserve each other." She turned, her shoulders rigid with anger, and marched out of his life, leaving behind a man who, on the night he celebrated his supreme freedom, had become a prisoner of a future he hadn't chosen and that now defined him completely. The brown cardboard box on the table wasn't a gift, it was a sentence, and he'd just begun serving it. The echo of Brooke's furious footsteps faded, leaving Richard in a silence more accusatory than any scream. The apartment, once a sanctuary of his power, now seemed vast and hostile, the shadows in the corners stretching like pointing fingers. He brought his hand to his cheek, where Brooke's ring had struck him. The physical pain was insignificant, a tiny point of sensation in an ocean of shock and denial threatening to drown him. His mind, an instrument of logic and strategy that had served him so well in business, now rebelled, refusing to accept the new reality. It was like a computer program encountering a paradox and entering an infinite error loop. Triplets. Laura. Father. The words swirled in his head, devoid of meaning. Absurd. "No," he whispered to the empty room. The word sounded weak, pathetic. He tried again, louder, trying to infuse it with the authority he'd always had. "No, it's a setup." Denial became his only defense mechanism, a fragile shield against an overwhelming truth. He began pacing, nervous energy propelling him, his brain working frantically to build an alternative narrative, one that put him back in control. "She forged everything," he said aloud, as if rehearsing a testimony. "The exams, the report, the doctor. She must have paid a fortune to this Dr. Abrams. That's it, it's a scam, a well-orchestrated scam to extort me." The idea, however implausible, offered a glimmer of hope. If it was a scam, he could fight. He could hire the best investigators, the most ruthless lawyers. He could expose her, destroy her, turn her into the villain and himself into the victim of a vengeful, unbalanced woman. Adrenaline began replacing the shock. He was back in his territory. War. Paul, his partner, who had remained in a corner, watching the collapse with a mix of alarm and morbid fascination, finally approached. He was a pragmatic man, whose friendship with Richard was based more on years of successful business than emotional affinity. "Richard, calm down. You're not thinking clearly." "Clearly? I've never thought more clearly," Richard retorted, his eyes shining with febrile intensity. "She planned this. It's the perfect revenge." Paul shook his head slowly, picking up the dossier from the box again. He wasn't a medical expert, but he was a master at assessing risks and detecting frauds. He leafed through the documents carefully. "Richard, look at this," he said, his voice calm and firm, trying to anchor his friend in reality. "This isn't an amateur forgery. Dr. Abrams's signature is notarized. The lab that did the blood work is one of the most reputable in the country. There are protocol numbers, stamps, dates. To forge something at this level, it would require a conspiracy involving dozens of people. And Dr. Abrams, the man's practically an institution. Risk his 50-year career for a bribe? It doesn't make sense." Each of Paul's words was a hammer demolishing Richard's fragile castle of denial. Then they're not mine," he tried, a new line of defense, even more desperate. "She slept with someone else. She's trying to pin another man's kids on me." Paul sighed, his patience waning. "Richard, her letter mentions the date. June 18th. Were you with her that night?" The memory hit him again, this time with unbearable clarity. The argument with Brooke on the phone, the feeling of emptiness, the silent walk to the bedroom that had once been theirs, Laura's calm presence in bed, the act itself. It hadn't been passionate, not even affectionate. It had been almost a reflex, an act of seeking a center of gravity in a world he himself was destabilizing. He didn't answer, but his silence was a confession. "She couldn't have known she'd get pregnant, let alone with triplets," Paul continued, relentless in his logic. "And she couldn't have invented a date that matches perfectly with a 12-week exam if it weren't true. The math is simple, man. The story fits." Reality finally breached the barriers. There was no conspiracy, no other man. The truth was simple, brutal, and inescapable. He was the father. The shield of denial shattered, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and terrified. The panic that followed was different from the initial shock. It was an active panic, a desperate mental race to mitigate the damage. His reputation, his image. What would the investors say? And the board? The story would leak, it was inevitable. The tabloids would feast. Tech magnate impregnates ex-wife with triplets after messy divorce. He could see the headlines. His life, once an example of success and control, would become a cheap soap opera. "I need to hush this up," he said, his voice now low and conspiratorial. He grabbed Paul's arm. "You have to help me. We need to control the narrative. We can say that it was a mutual decision. Artificial insemination, yes, that we'd planned this before the divorce and decided to go through with it as friends." Paul stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Richard, you've spent months telling everyone she was dead weight you were shedding. You humiliated her in the divorce settlement. No one's going to buy this friend's story. And her letter. The box. The scene Brooke made. There are 50 witnesses who saw your shock. The story already has a version, and it's not yours." Richard's desperation turned to rage, a rage directed at everyone but himself. "So what do I do? Sit and watch my life get destroyed by her? You hire the best family lawyer money can buy, not to fight, but to negotiate. You acknowledge paternity publicly before the story leaks in a distorted way. You issue a statement, say that despite personal differences, you're both committed to the children's well-being. You turn the narrative from scandal to post-divorce maturity. It's your only play, Richard. You need to get ahead of the story." While Paul spoke, Richard's mind was already racing in another direction. Control. He needed control, not just of the narrative, but of Laura. He could make her life a legal hell. He could fight for custody, use his fortune to exhaust her in court proceedings. He could demand DNA tests for each baby, dragging out the process, sowing doubts. The idea of making her suffer, of making her pay for the humiliation she'd caused him, began to mix with his panic. If he couldn't win the public opinion war, maybe he could win the war of attrition. He spent the rest of the night alone in his ruined penthouse, alternating between waves of paralyzing panic and bursts of Machiavellian fury. He called his lead lawyer at 3 in the morning, waking him and dumping the story incoherently and angrily. He smashed an expensive vase, hurling it against the wall in a fit of impotent frustration. He drank whiskey straight from the bottle, but the alcohol brought no numbness, only sharpening the edges of his despair. He looked at the box again, at the white woolen booty, an object so small but holding the power to demolish an empire. He picked it up. The wool was soft against his fingers. For a fleeting instant, an image formed in his mind. A tiny foot inside that shoe. A face. A child. The image was so overwhelming, so alien to his reality, that he repelled it violently, as if it were a virus. He wasn't ready to be a father. He'd never wanted to be a father. Fatherhood was a form of weakness, of loss of control, of becoming secondary in one's own life. And now he'd be a father to 3. The night dragged on, a torture of circular thoughts. Denial had failed. Rage was useless. What remained was fear. A cold, deep fear he hadn't felt since the days he lay in a hospital bed, uncertain if he'd walk again. Back then, Laura had been his salvation. Now, she was the architect of his downfall. And as the first hint of dawn painted San Francisco's sky in shades of gray and purple, Richard Hayes realized a terrifying truth. He was completely, irretrievably alone in a disaster he'd created himself. The party was over, and the bill had arrived. And it was unpayable. The months following the fateful party were a whirlwind of lawsuits, headlines, and relentless public pressure for Richard. The strategy of controlling the narrative had failed miserably. The story of the triplets, leaked by some anonymous source, exploded in the media. He became the villain of the tale, the callous tech magnate who abandoned the woman who saved him and now tried to shirk his parental responsibilities. His once impeccable image was in tatters. Investors began questioning his emotional stability, and some key contracts were frozen. Hayes Tech, his empire, began feeling the tremors of its founder's personal earthquake. Laura, on the other hand, maintained a dignified silence that only amplified Richard's guilt. She gave no interviews, made no public statements. Her only communication was through her lawyers, who, with calculated coldness, filed every step of the paternity recognition and child support process. She refused any out-of-court settlement that implied secrecy or waiving her rights. She wanted everything done in the light of day, through legal channels, with no loopholes for manipulation or denial. Her determination was unshakable, and Richard, in his fury, realized he was dealing with a force he'd dangerously underestimated. The court battle over child support was brutal. Richard, advised by his lawyers, tried everything to minimize the amount. He presented complex income statements, alleged exorbitant expenses, and tried to argue that Laura, as a physical therapist, had the capacity to provide for the children. His lawyers painted a picture of an overburdened businessman being extorted by a vengeful ex-wife. The judge, the same Judge Carson who'd presided over the divorce, heard everything with almost monastic patience. He allowed Richard's lawyers to present all their arguments, all their accounting maneuvers. But when it was Laura's defense's turn, the strategy was simple and devastating. They didn't focus on complex numbers, but on Richard's reality. They presented photos of his penthouse, his luxury cars, his trips, his parties. They detailed the cost of his divorce party, the value of the ring he'd given Brooke, the investments in his company. The message was clear. Richard Hayes lived a life of ostentation and unlimited luxury. "Your Honor," argued Laura's lawyer with a calm and firm voice, "Mr. Hayes claims financial difficulties in providing for his children while maintaining a standard of living most Americans can only dream of. He built an empire on the premise that he's a successful man, a visionary. Now, when it comes to his most basic responsibilities, he tries to hide behind numbers. The issue isn't whether Ms. Bennett can provide for her children, but whether Mr. Hayes, with his undeniable fortune, can provide for them with the same standard of living he enjoys." The judge, in his ruling, was unrelenting. He not only dismissed Richard's claims, but made a point to highlight the discrepancy between the entrepreneur's public image and his attempt to evade his obligations. This court cannot ignore reality. Mr. Richard Hayes is a man of substantial financial resources. His children, regardless of the circumstances of their conception, have the right to enjoy a standard of living compatible with their fathers. Child support will be set at an amount that reflects not only the triplets' needs, but also the defendants' economic capacity, ensuring them access to the best education, health, and well-being. The determined amount was astronomical, a financial blow that, while not bankrupting him, would force him to seriously rethink his spending and investments. Richard left the courtroom pale-faced, defeat etched in every feature. He'd lost. And the loss wasn't just financial. It was a loss of control, a public humiliation that corroded his image of invincibility. While Richard drowned in his own misery, Brooke watched everything from afar. After the humiliation of the party and the breakup, she'd tried to rebuild her life. But life without Richard's glamour and luxury was ordinary. Her days were filled with the hard work of a regular executive assistant, without the fancy dinners, first-class trips, extravagant gifts. She saw the news about the massive child support, and a seed of regret began to sprout. Pride, she realized, was a luxury she couldn't afford. Richard, despite everything, was still a rich man, and with the support, his children would be even richer. She started sending discreet messages to Richard, initially with flimsy excuses about wanting to know how he was, or apologizing for the scene. Richard, isolated and wounded, was surprisingly receptive. Brooke's presence, with her beauty and apparent understanding, was a balm for his ego. He felt like a pariah, and having someone who looked at him with admiration, even if forced, was a relief. Brooke, astute, spotted the opening. She began reintegrating into Richard's life, not as a lover but as a friend, confidant. She listened to him complain about Laura, the support, the world's injustice. She praised him, reminded him of his genius and how he was wronged. Her plan was clear. Reclaim her place beside him no matter the cost. Laura's children would be an inconvenience, yes, but one she could learn to tolerate, especially if it meant returning to the luxurious life she craved. Brooke's illusion, however, began to crumble when the triplets were born. 2 boys, Liam and Noah, and a girl, Sophia, all healthy and, to Richard's despair, undeniably resembling him. The mandatory visits to Laura's apartment, a place that now seemed an oasis of calm and warmth, became routine. Brooke, in her attempt to appear supportive, started accompanying him. She tried to project the image of a modern, caring stepmom, but the reality was very different. During one of these visits, Brooke sat on the couch impeccably dressed, while Richard awkwardly tried to hold Liam, who cried incessantly. Laura was in the bedroom, nursing Sophia and Noah. Richard, visibly frustrated, rocked the baby with little coordination. "I don't know what to do with this," he exclaimed, looking at Brooke as if expecting her to solve the problem. Brooke, with a sigh of impatience, rolled her eyes. "He must be hungry or have a dirty diaper. Give him to the nanny." She kept a safe distance from the baby, as if the crying were contagious. "There's no nanny here right now, Brooke," Richard replied, his voice tense. "And the diaper's clean." "Laura said he's got colic." Brooke made a grimace of disgust. "Colic? Richard, for God's sake, it's not a company project, it's a baby. Let him cry, he'll stop eventually." The coldness and disinterest in her voice were shocking. She didn't see a suffering baby there, Richard's son, but an inconvenience, a noisy obstacle in her path to a life of luxury. The image of her, perfectly made up, looking at little Liam with contempt, was a watershed moment for Richard. In that instant, something broke inside him. He saw Brooke not as the ideal partner, but as a stranger, an empty woman who only cared about the surface. The loneliness he felt beside her was infinitely deeper than being alone. He realized her interest wasn't in him, nor in the family they could form, but solely in what he could provide. She wasn't willing to share the burden, the joy, the mess of real life. She wanted only the shine, without the substance. He looked at little Liam in his arms, the crying subsiding a bit, perhaps sensing the change in his father's energy. Richard, for the first time, didn't feel anger or frustration, but a pang of responsibility, of connection. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't just let him cry. "Brooke," he said, his voice low but firm, "I think you should go." She stared at him, shocked. "Go? But I came to support you." "No, you came to see what you can get out of this," he replied, the bitter truth in his voice. "You don't understand anything about what's happening here. You don't understand anything about me, or about them." He gestured to the baby in his arms. Brooke, realizing her game had been exposed, tried to argue, but Richard wasn't listening anymore. He escorted her to the door, and when she left, there was no drama like at the party, just a heavy silence. He returned to the living room, the baby still in his arms, and sat on the couch. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about himself, his reputation, his fortune. He was thinking about that small being in his arms and the other two Laura was nursing. The life he'd tried to deny was there, real, tangible, and demanding something from him that money couldn't buy: presence. The first year of the triplets' lives passed like a hurricane, a blur of sleepless nights, unison cries, and moments of pure, overwhelming joy that almost hurt. For Laura, it was a period of rediscovering her own strength. She, who had once rebuilt a man, now built 3 lives from scratch. The child support from Richard ensured material comfort, a spacious and safe apartment, a nanny's help, access to the best healthcare, but it was Laura's resilience that turned the house into a home. She moved through the organized chaos with a grace and competence that were mesmerizing. Each bottle prepared, each lullaby whispered, each fever monitored through the night was an act of love, and another brick in the wall she built around her new world, a world where she was the sole and sovereign architect. For Richard, that year was a slow and painful journey of deconstruction. After the definitive breakup with Brooke, he found himself in a vacuum. The Hayes tech empire, shaken by the scandal, demanded his attention, but his work, once the center of his identity, now seemed hollow. Victories in business didn't bring the same ecstasy. Parties and social events became a burden, a stage where he felt constantly judged. Visits to his children, which started as a bitter legal obligation, gradually transformed into the only point of authenticity in his artificial life. He watched Laura, no longer with the anger of an adversary, but with the confused admiration of someone seeing something lost and not knowing how to name it. He saw her patience in dealing with 3 emerging and distinct personalities: Sophia's observant calm, Liam's explosive energy, Noah's needy sweetness. He saw how she talked to them, not as babies, but as little people, explaining the world in a soft voice. And in her eyes he no longer saw the woman he'd discarded, but the rock that had once saved him, now channeling all that strength into their children. Richard's regret was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical presence, a chronic ache in his chest. He didn't just miss a family, he missed her, her calm, her integrity, the center of gravity she represented. On the triplets' first birthday, Richard arrived at Laura's apartment feeling like a foreigner seeking asylum. He brought gifts but knew they were insignificant. What he wanted to give was something money couldn't buy: a confession, an apology, a plea. He'd spent weeks rehearsing a speech in his mind, words that might somehow begin building a bridge over the abyss he'd dug himself. He loved her. The realization was so clear and so painful, it left him breathless. He wanted a second chance, not to have the perfect family back, but to, perhaps, deserve to be part of the one that existed now. When Laura opened the door, she smiled, a genuine smile without traces of animosity. "Richard, come in. They're in the living room." The apartment was decorated simply, with balloons and a cake on the table. It was an intimate celebration. Richard entered, his heart pounding against his ribs, ready to start his speech. But he stopped. In the living room, playing on the rug with the 3 babies, was another person, a woman. It was Brooke. The shock was so deep, so visceral that Richard felt the ground waver under his feet. Brooke, there, in Laura's home. She wasn't wearing the designer clothes or impeccable makeup from before. She was in jeans, a t-shirt, her hair tied in a simple ponytail. She didn't look like a predator, but normal. She lifted her eyes, saw Richard, and gave a smile without malice, almost shy. "Richard," Laura began, noticing his paralyzing confusion. "There's something I need to tell you." She guided him to the kitchen, leaving Brooke with the children. "What is she doing here?" he managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper. "She reached out to me a few months ago," Laura explained, her voice calm. "After you and she ended things, she was lost, regretful, not for losing you or the money, but for who she'd become. She asked for forgiveness. Not for being with you, but for participating in trying to diminish me, for being complicit in your cruelty." Richard stared at her, incredulous. "And you? You forgave her? After everything?" "Forgiveness is part of the story," Laura said. "Brooke started therapy, and she started visiting me. At first it was awkward, but she was good with the kids, and she needed something real in her life as much as I needed extra help now and then. She became a friend, an aunt to them. The revelation was more shocking than if she'd introduced a new fiancé. A new love would be a replacement. This was an alliance forged in the ashes of the man both had once thought they loved. It was the final proof that their world no longer revolved around him. They'd moved on together. "But that's not all," Laura continued, and there was a new tone in her voice, a seriousness that made Richard hold his breath. "The child support you pay. I didn't use all of it. In fact, I used very little. The rest I invested." "Invested?" he asked, confused. "Yes. With Brooke's help, who still had many contacts and a surprisingly sharp mind for business, I started a project, a foundation, a state-of-the-art neurological rehabilitation clinic for low-income families, using the most advanced techniques, the same ones I used with you. A place that doesn't rely on limited insurance or philanthropists' goodwill." She paused, looking him directly in the eyes. "The Bennett Foundation opens its doors next month, and I used your money, the money from your punishment, to build it. Every brick, every piece of cutting-edge equipment was paid for by you." Richard felt as if the air had been stolen from his lungs. That was the true checkmate. She hadn't just moved on. She'd taken the weapons he'd used against her, the money, the humiliation, even the woman he'd used to replace her, and transformed them into a legacy. A legacy that was the antithesis of everything he stood for. He'd wanted to use his money to control her. She'd used it to create something that would help hundreds of people. He'd called her dead weight. She'd become a creative force. "I wanted you to know," Laura said, her voice soft but with the finality of a sentence. "So you understand there's nothing left to dispute between us. You'll fulfill your obligation as a father, visit your children, and I'll be grateful for that. But my life, their life, the story we're building, it doesn't need you as the protagonist anymore. You're just the initial funding source." She turned and went back to the living room, leaving him alone in the kitchen. He could hear the laughter. Laura's laughter, Brooke's, and the joyful squeals of his 3 children. It was the sound of a complete world, a world of which he was the unwitting architect and the eternal exile. He looked out the window at the city he'd once thought he'd conquered. He hadn't lost just a woman or a family. He'd lost his own narrative. Laura hadn't just rewritten the end of their story. She'd published an entirely new book, and his name appeared only on the acknowledgements page as an ironic footnote. And that, he realized with crushing clarity, was the most perfect and devastating revenge. Did you like today's story? Then click on the video that's appearing on your screen. I'm sure you'll like it too. And don't forget to leave a like and follow our channel. Thank you very much and see you next time.